In 1981, the British electronics firm Racal bought the Decca empire, glanced at its radio and television division, and immediately sold it off to Tatung, a Taiwanese manufacturing conglomerate. The vast production lines at Bridgnorth in Shropshire fell quiet, and operations were hastily relocated. British cabinet makers, service engineers, and assembly workers lost a lineage that had defined domestic sound. The Decca badge, once screwed onto the front of magnificent heavy wooden radiograms, became a hollow ghost, reduced to a private label sticker slapped onto imported plastic receivers. A decade earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Decca had defined the absolute peak of British high-fidelity listening, building acoustic furniture so monumental it required multiple men to carry it into a home. But the real story of Decca Radio and television is not just the story of a 1981 corporate fire sale. It is the story of how the British sitting room shifted from trusting monumental acoustic engineering to rewarding the brutal price logic of globalized imports. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how Britain heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in London in 1938. In London in 1938, the Decca Record Company, under the leadership of Edward Lewis, was facing a fundamental limitation of the British market. The company was thriving on the high street, pressing and selling millions of 78 RPM shellac discs. But a record company is entirely dependent on the machine the customer owns. In thousands of British sitting rooms, those machines were profoundly inadequate. The standard pre-war wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source, was often a compromise of acoustics and affordability. It was built primarily to capture the BBC national program or the regional program, using a basic aerial, a wire or internal component that receives radio waves from the air. The internal loudspeaker, the moving paper cone that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, was usually housed in a thin, resonant wooden cabinet that heavily colored the audio. High notes were lost to the ether. Low notes became a muddy, indistinct rumble. The sound was not a faithful reproduction. It was merely a vibrating approximation of reality. Decca saw this gap. They did not just want to sell the music, they wanted to control the air it moved through. In 1938, Decca Radio and Television Leliti was formally established as a distinct manufacturing arm. The objective was simple, yet highly arrogant for a company known mainly for pressing shellac: build the hardware that could actually justify the audio quality of the Decca badge. However, before this domestic ambition could fully reach the British high street, the market was abruptly suspended. War broke out. The domestic radio factories across Britain were entirely repurposed for the military effort. Decca's engineers turned their attention away from the sitting room and towards the lethal waters of the English Channel and the North Atlantic. During the Second World War, the British military required absolute acoustic precision. Decca developed the Decca Navigator system, an advanced radio tracking network that guided ships through minefields. More importantly for the future of British audio, their engineers worked on classified acoustic systems to detect the exact, microscopic engine signatures of German submarines. To hear a submarine accurately, the recording and playback equipment had to capture frequencies far beyond the capability of any standard pre-war radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. Out of this wartime necessity, Decca's engineers developed Furpoint, or full-frequency range recording. It was a monumental military triumph. It captured a vastly expanded spectrum of sound, from the deepest bass to the highest treble. And when the war ended in 1945, Decca found itself holding a military-grade acoustic technology, with no immediate domestic hardware capable of playing it. The British absence was now glaring. By 1946, the country was exhausted, heavily rationed, and culturally austere. The average domestic radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, was often a tired, pre-war valve radio that had survived the Blitz. A valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, required meticulous maintenance, and many had not seen a service engineer in years. If a listener tuned their dial, the scale that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to the newly established BBC Home Service, or sought out the light program on medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, they heard a flattened, compressed version of the broadcast. The music lacked depth. The voices lacked presence. The room felt empty. Decca decided that the post-war British listener deserved something vastly better. They deserved the fidelity of radar-grade engineering brought directly into the domestic front room. Operating from their corporate headquarters at 13 Brixton Road in London, and utilizing advanced manufacturing facilities in New Malden, Surrey, Decca Radio, and Television, began to design receivers that treated the broadcast signal with profound, almost obsessive respect. The earliest post-war Decca radios and record reproducers were fiercely expensive. While the average British weekly wage in 1946 hovered around £5, Decca's high-fidelity equipment was positioned unapologetically as a luxury investment. The engineers were not instructed to build to a low price point for the mass market. They were instructed to build a cabinet that did not rattle, a valve circuit that did not distort, and a loudspeaker that pushed air with exact measured force. Decca debuted their new post-war audio philosophy to the public at the Radiolympia exhibition in London, the premier showcase for the British radio industry. The trade magazines, such as Wireless World, took immediate notice of the specifications. Here was a company bridging the gap between the record press, the military laboratory, and the domestic radio dial. Decca's high street dealers, initially concentrated in London and the affluent home counties, received promotional materials that spoke of scientific precision rather than mere musical entertainment. The sales pitch in the shop window was formidable. Decca argued that buying a cheap vibrating radio to listen to a full BBC symphony orchestra was a false economy. Every component was scrutinized. The tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, had to be exact. The valves had to be perfectly matched. The heavy wooden cabinet had to be acoustically dead, acting as a true, solid baffle for the speaker rather than a resonating drum. The British market, starved of luxury, exhausted by utility, and desperate for entertainment, responded. The BBC was expanding its high-quality musical broadcasts, and a segment of the public wanted to hear them properly. The wealthy, the early audio enthusiasts, and the dedicated music lovers began to actively seek out the Decca badge. A Decca set in the sitting room quickly became a statement. It signaled that the household cared about the signal. It cared about the sound. It cared about the science behind the speaker grill, the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet. By the late 1940s, Decca Radio and Television had successfully transitioned from a mere offshoot of a record label into a serious, independent force in British electronics. They had the patents. They had the radar-hardened engineers. They had the ear of the domestic audience. But a standard table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, was not enough to contain their ambition. To truly prove what British acoustic engineering could achieve, Decca needed to build something larger, something uncompromising, something that would command the British sitting room for a generation. In 1946, the answer emerged from Decca's engineering facilities, and it was a machine that fundamentally altered the expectations of the British audio market. It was called the Decca Decola. To simply call it a radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, is to aggressively understate its physical and cultural gravity. The Decola was a monument to acoustic science. It was designed to dominate the British sitting room, demanding absolute attention both visually and sonically. Measuring nearly 4 feet wide and weighing substantially more than an adult man, it was housed in exquisite bird's-eye maple, mahogany, or burr walnut veneers. The cabinet, the wooden body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance, was not merely decorative furniture. It was engineered as a rigid acoustic vault. A standard, mass-produced radio cabinet often resonated when played loudly, adding an artificial, booming coloration to the sound. The Decola's cabinet was built to remain entirely acoustically dead, ensuring that the only vibrations entering the room came from the broadcast itself, not from the flexing of the timber. Inside this vault, Decca deployed the full weight of their wartime radar experience. The heart of the machine was its amplifier, an electronic circuit that increases the strength of the audio signal before it reaches the speakers. Standard pre-war amplifiers distorted heavily at high volumes and lost high frequencies entirely, making music sound muffled and constrained. The Decola's amplifier was powered by a massive array of meticulously matched valves, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals with intense heat and high voltage. This circuit was designed to be perfectly flat and accurate across the entire spectrum of human hearing, from the deepest bass notes to the sharpest treble. Crucially, the Decola did not attempt to push this massive audio power through a single struggling paper cone. Instead, Decca engineers installed an array of 3 massive loudspeakers, the parts of a radio that turn the electrical signal into sound moving through air. These drivers, the moving parts of a loudspeaker that physically push the air, were angled precisely behind an expansive, curved front grille, the fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the cabinet. This 3-speaker array created a physical illusion of space, dispersing the sound widely and evenly across a large drawing room, replicating the feeling of sitting in a concert hall. While the Decola was famously built to reproduce Decca's new 4 shellac records using a featherweight sapphire stylus, its radio receiver, the device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, was equally uncompromising. In September 1946, the BBC launched the 3rd program, a new national radio service dedicated to classical music, full-length stage plays, and demanding intellectual discussion. The standard British table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, could barely do justice to a live broadcast of a symphony orchestra. The violins sounded like wire. The timpani sounded like cardboard. The voices sounded trapped inside a box. The Decola's receiver was engineered specifically to capture the 3rd program in its absolute entirety. The tuning dial, the scale that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was a precise, beautifully illuminated instrument. Behind that glowing glass, the tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, moved with heavy, fluid, mechanical resistance. With a properly installed outdoor aerial, a wire or external component that receives radio waves from the air, the Decola locked onto the medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, with absolute stability. It possessed immense selectivity. How well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, stripping away the hiss, fading, and interference that plagued cheaper, smaller sets. This level of acoustic perfection came at a staggering, almost violent cost. Upon its launch, the fundamental Decca Decola carried a price tag of over $216, plus a punishing post-war purchase tax that pushed the final cost to the consumer far higher. To understand the weight of that price, one must look at the British economy of the era. In the late 1940s, the average British weekly wage was roughly £5. A Decola cost more than a year's gross salary for a working-class man. It was the price of a small parcel of land. It was a significant deposit on a suburban house. Consequently, Decca did not attempt to sell the Decola through ordinary channels. They bypassed the standard catalog. They bypassed the provincial high street. They bypassed the local repair counter. Instead, this machine was placed in the most exclusive retail environments in Britain. It occupied the pristine acoustic showrooms of Harrods in Knightsbridge. It was demonstrated with quiet reverence in the audio departments of Selfridges. It was sold through elite, specialized radio dealers in Mayfair and the affluent suburbs of the home counties. The critical reception from the trade was immediate and reverent. The demanding engineers at Wireless World magazine, the strict technical Bible of the British radio industry, dissected its circuitry and praised its unprecedented lack of distortion. The Gramophone magazine reviewed it not as a domestic consumer appliance, but as a definitive scientific instrument for musical truth. Enthusiasts, affluent audiophiles, and dedicated BBC listeners recognized that Decca had created a distinct, unassailable British radio moat. Companies like Bush, Murphy, and EKSO were undisputed masters of the mass market, building beautiful, reliable bakelite radios for millions of ordinary households. Decca chose not to fight them in the kitchen. Instead, they claimed the absolute, undisputed peak of the market. They proved that a British manufacturer, forged in the urgency of military production, could build acoustic hardware that rivaled or exceeded anything produced in America or Europe. The true commercial genius of the Decola, however, was the halo of authority it cast over the entire Decca radio and television division. Because Decca could build the Decola, the British public assumed that every other radio leaving their factory contained a fraction of that magic. When a middle-class family later walked into a standard provincial radio shop to buy a smaller, more affordable Decca wooden table radio, they were not just buying a box of valves and copper wire. They were buying a piece of the company that had mastered radar, invented au-fa-roir, and built the ultimate radiogram. The heavy cabinet, the warm glow of the dial lamps, and the deep, resonant tone proved that Decca understood the profound responsibility of moving air inside a British room. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. The Decola was a monumental statement of intent, but a company cannot sustain an empire solely by selling 200-pound acoustic vaults to Mayfair aristocrats. To build a true industrial powerhouse, Decca had to take the uncompromising engineering principles forged in wartime radar laboratories and scale them for the broader British high street. Through the 1950s, Decca Radio and television embarked on an aggressive, highly calculated expansion. They rapidly outgrew their initial constrained production facilities in New Malden and Battersea. The manufacturing heart of the Decca hardware empire was entirely relocated to a massive 10-acre site in Bridgnorth, Shropshire. This was no longer a boutique acoustic workshop. It was a sprawling, highly synchronized industrial complex. At the Bridgnorth plant, Hundreds of British workers assembled the heavy, complex chassis required for high-fidelity reception. They soldered printed circuit boards, boards carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, alongside heavy mains transformers and finely wound tuning coils. To support this manufacturing scale, Decca established a dedicated Advanced Research and Development Center in Bradford, West Yorkshire, ensuring that their receiver technology remained at the absolute forefront of the domestic market. With this formidable industrial infrastructure in place, Decca began to systematically colonize the middle-class British sitting room. They introduced the Decalion line of record reproducers and a broad range of beautifully veneered, heavily built table radios. These sets still utilized the thick, acoustically inert cabinets that the company championed, but they were priced for the affluent suburban family rather than the landed gentry. The distribution network expanded with equal aggression. A Decca radio could still be purchased in the hushed, carpeted audio departments of Harrods, but it was now also prominently displayed in the bustling, brightly lit shop windows of Currys, a major British high street electrical retailer. It was heavily stocked by independent, specialist radio dealers in provincial high streets from Glasgow to Southend-on-Sea. Crucially, Decca integrated deeply into the booming British radio rental market. Companies like Radio Rentals, a business model where customers paid a weekly fee to rent radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright, strongly favored Decca sets. Rental companies required absolute, uncompromising reliability. A broken radio meant a costly, unprofitable service call by a local engineer. Decca's heavily over-engineered chassis, premium valves, and robust point-to-point soldering meant their receivers survived years of relentless daily use without failing. The 1950s and early 1960s marked the absolute golden age of the British radiogram, and Decca dominated the premium tier of this market. The radiogram was not merely an electronic device. It was the physical and acoustic focal point of the front room. It stood as a vital piece of domestic architecture alongside the fireplace and the sideboard. When the Decca Record Company pioneered the transition from mono to stereo records, introducing their full-frequency stereophonic sound, or FSS, the radio and television division built the exact hardware required to prove the technology worked. A Decca stereogram was a massive, imposing piece of teak or walnut furniture. Behind its sliding wooden doors lay an intricate, highly sensitive tuning dial, glowing warmly under the light of small dial lamps. Beneath the heavy lid sat a precision turntable. At either end of the wide cabinet, massive loudspeakers pushed air with effortless, measured force. By the late 1950s, the BBC was broadcasting a rich, demanding mix of content. The massive Droitwich transmitting station, the primary long-wave transmitter pushing national signals across the entire country, was carrying the light program into millions of homes. When a family gathered around a Decca radiogram to listen to a live orchestral broadcast or an evening radio play, they experienced a depth of sound that cheaper, mass-produced competitors simply could not replicate. The bass was incredibly warm. The treble was sharp and defined. The massive wooden cabinet did not rattle or distort the signal. At the absolute peak of the valve era, a Decca radiogram sitting in a suburban British front room, its dial glowing warmly in the evening dark, its twin loudspeakers moving air with effortless precision, represented the zenith of domestic listening. It was an agreement between the broadcast, the cabinet, and the room. But the British radio market was not static. The era of the heavy, immovable valve radio was beginning to wane. The transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a valve, was fundamentally changing how people listened. Radio was no longer tethered to the mains plug in the sitting room. It was becoming portable. It was moving to the kitchen, the garden, and the passenger seat of the car. Decca, a company built on massive acoustic furniture, had to prove it could shrink its engineering without losing its soul. The transition from the heavy, immobile valve era to the portable age presented a profound structural challenge to a company built on massive acoustic furniture. By the late 1950s, the British listening habit was leaving the front room. The transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and more battery-friendly, was transforming broadcasting from a communal household event into a personal, mobile experience. Decca understood that if they only manufactured 200-pound walnut radiograms, they would lose the kitchen, the garden, and the younger generation entirely. But a Decca could not simply be a cheap, vibrating plastic box. It had to maintain the acoustic dignity of the badge. Their answer was the Decca Debonair line alongside robust models like the TP22. These were not disposable novelties. A Decca transistor radio was a serious piece of portable engineering. Assembled at the Bridgenorth plant, these sets were often housed in sturdy wooden frames, tightly wrapped in durable Rexine or leatherette, and finished with heavy brass or chrome trims. The tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was large, legible, and mechanically smooth. Inside the cabinet, Decca engineers refused to compromise on reception. They installed unusually long ferrite rod aerials, a small internal component often used in portable radios for medium-wave reception. This allowed a Decca portable to lock onto the BBC Light program or Radio Luxembourg with a tenacious grip, even deep inside a brick-built British terraced house. The loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, was oversized for a portable, designed to provide a warm, fatigue-free tone rather than a harsh, tinny screech. This was the era when the British Wireless moved outdoors. A Decca portable went to the shingle beaches of Brighton. It sat on tartan picnic blankets in the home counties. It rested on the dashboards of Ford Cortinas and Austin Minis. It brought Test Match Special into the potting shed. Decca had successfully proven that a battery radio, a radio powered by internal dry cells rather than a mains socket, did not have to sound like a compromise. It could still sound like a Decca. By the mid-1960s, Decca radio and television operated at a staggering industrial scale. The 10-acre Bridgenorth factory was a humming, highly choreographed city of domestic electronics. Thousands of workers were employed across assembly lines, testing bays, and cabinet-making workshops. Beyond radios and radiograms, Bridgenorth was pushing out thousands of Decca television sets, integrating their revered audio circuitry with the visual broadcast. The distribution and service network had reached absolute saturation. A British consumer could browse a thick, glossy catalog and order a Decca set for delivery. They could walk down the local high street, the primary commercial thoroughfare of any British town, and see the Decca logo illuminated in the window of a proudly independent electrical dealer. They could sign a contract at a radio rentals branch, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright, knowing that the heavy Decca chassis would not fail them. The peak of the Decca radio empire was not defined by a single model, but by the sheer, unassailable presence of the brand across multiple acoustic tiers. In the wealthy drawing rooms of Mayfair, a Decca stereogram played FFS, vinyl records with radar-grade precision. In the suburban sitting rooms of Birmingham, a Decca valve table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, warmed the evening with the home service. In the kitchens and gardens of Yorkshire, a Decca debonair pulled voices from the air with reliable clarity. At this cultural zenith, the British public did not merely buy Decca hardware. They implicitly trusted the engineering philosophy behind it. Britain had built a domestic acoustic empire where the heavy wooden object on the sideboard was as respected as the national broadcaster it was tuned to. It was a deeply physical, tactile era of listening, built on the assumption that British factories would always make the cabinets, British engineers would always design the circuits, and British high street shops would always sell the sets. But that assumption was fundamentally fragile. The global market was about to prove that acoustic perfection mattered far less than aggressive pricing, and the great Bridgnorth factory was about to face a storm it could not engineer its way out of. The collapse of the Decca radio empire was not caused by a sudden loss of engineering talent, nor by a dramatic failure of their hardware. A Decca receiver built in 1970 was just as acoustically precise as one built in 1950. The tragedy of the Bridgnorth plant was far more systemic. The company found itself trapped by the very forces that had once made it great: heavy British manufacturing, premium acoustic furniture, and a rigid traditional retail network. The structural unraveling of Decca radio and television began at the intersection of two distinct market forces. Force 5, a fundamental technological and cultural shift in how people listened, and Force 1, the spiraling, unsustainable cost of British domestic manufacturing. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the aesthetic and acoustic expectations of the British sitting room were rapidly changing. For 2 decades, the Decca radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, had been the ultimate status symbol of domestic audio. It was designed to look like a permanent fixture, blending seamlessly with mahogany sideboards and heavy armchairs. But a new generation of British listeners, driven by the explosion of stereo rock and pop music, no longer wanted their technology hidden inside traditional woodwork. They wanted hi-fi separates, a modular audio system where the radio tuner, the amplifier, the record player, and the loudspeakers were all distinct, independent units, connected by trailing wires. This shift from the unified cabinet to the modular shelf fundamentally undermined Decca's core industrial advantage. The sprawling 10-acre Bridgnorth factory was, in many ways, an advanced carpentry and heavy metalwork facility. Their acoustic superiority relied on building massive, rigid, vibration-free wooden cabinets, the heavy timber enclosures that shaped the sound and housed the electronics. As the British economy entered the turbulent 1970s, the cost of maintaining this kind of heavy manufacturing became devastating. The price of premium timber veneers skyrocketed. The wages for highly skilled British cabinet makers, solderers, and assembly workers rose sharply against a backdrop of severe national inflation. Building a beautiful 200-pound Decca stereogram required an immense investment of manual labor and raw materials before it even left the factory floor. Decca discovered that they were producing an impeccably engineered acoustic monument that the evolving high street simply did not want to stock. Traditional British radio dealers, the independent shop owners who had proudly demonstrated Decca Decolas to affluent suburbanites, were facing their own intense commercial pressures. A massive radiogram took up a vast amount of valuable floor space in a shop window. It required 2 strong men and a dedicated delivery van to transport it to a customer's home. High-street electrical retailers increasingly favored boxes they could stack on shelves, sell quickly, and hand over the counter to a customer waiting in a Ford Cortina. The market was accelerating, and Decca's hardware was physically too heavy to keep up. Simultaneously, the British radio market was being aggressively re-educated by Force 4, the arrival of fierce, highly advanced imported electronics. Japanese manufacturers like Sony, Pioneer, and National Panasonic did not attempt to beat Decca at traditional carpentry. Instead, they completely redefined what a premium radio receiver should look like. The imported receivers arriving in Britain were sleek, sharp, and unapologetically modern. They replaced warm burr walnut with cold, brushed aluminum fascias. They replaced traditional, glowing glass tuning dials, the scales showing which station the radio is tuned to, with heavily weighted, precision-engineered metal tuning knobs that spun with surgical smoothness. Inside, these Japanese sets utilized highly efficient, mass-produced transistors, small electronic components that control or amplify signals with less heat and power than older valves, mounted on densely packed printed circuit boards. These imported hi-fi separates and portable radios were lighter, often cheaper, and perfectly matched the modern aesthetic of a 1970s British flat. More importantly, they were fiercely reliable. They were built on automated assembly lines with economies of scale that a traditional British factory in Shropshire simply could not match. Decca Radio and Television attempted to respond to this existential threat. They launched their own modular systems, such as the Decca sound line of unit audio separates. They designed smaller stereo receivers and bookshelf loudspeakers, the parts of a radio system that turn the electrical signal into sound, now housed in separate, smaller boxes. But a corporate giant built on radar contracts and monumental acoustic furniture could not easily pivot to building lightweight, high-volume electronics. Their reflexes were too slow. Their overheads were too high. When a British consumer compared a Decca separate system against a similarly priced Japanese receiver, the Decca often felt like an awkward compromise, a traditional wooden box trying unconvincingly to wear a modern face. The Bridgnorth factory was caught in an industrial trap. They were trying to sustain a massive British workforce, a deep research and development budget in Bradford, and an uncompromising acoustic philosophy, all while selling into a high street that was increasingly obsessed with the sleek, the modular, and the aggressively priced. The margins collapsed. The catalog pages shrank. The proud Decca badge, which had once promised absolute radar-grade precision, was slowly being drowned out by the sheer volume of globalized electronics. The British sitting room was changing, and the great wooden vaults of Bridgnorth were being left behind. As the 1970s progressed, the financial reality of maintaining a premium British electronics manufacturing base became completely untenable. The sprawling 10-acre Bridgnorth factory was increasingly operating as an industrial relic. The heavy, meticulous craftsmanship that defined a Decca radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, was fundamentally at odds with a global market moving towards disposable efficiency. Decca was also losing its vital stronghold in the British high street rental sector. For decades, companies like Radio Rentals, a business model where customers rented radio or television equipment rather than buying it outright, had favored Decca's heavy, over-engineered chassis. However, by the late 1970s, the rental market for audio equipment was collapsing. Transistor radios, portable radios that use small semiconductor devices instead of valves, had become so cheap to mass-produce in Asia that renting a radio was no longer an economic necessity for a British family. A consumer could simply walk into a discount high-street shop, purchase a Japanese or Hong Kong import outright, and throw it away if it broke. The age of the local service engineer carefully repairing a Decca circuit board on a dusty workbench was rapidly coming to an end. The parent company, the Decca Record Company under Sir Edward Lewis, was severely overextended and bleeding capital. The Consumer Electronics Division, once the proud bridge between radar-grade military engineering and the British sitting room, was now widely viewed by financial analysts as a heavy, unprofitable liability. It simply cost too much money to build wooden radio cabinets in Shropshire, when the rest of the world was injection molding plastic in Taipei and Tokyo. In early 1980, the crisis reached its terminal phase. Racal, a highly successful British military communications and radar company, launched a takeover bid for the entire Decca empire. Racal was fiercely interested in acquiring Decca's marine navigation systems, avionics, and radar divisions. They wanted the military contracts. They wanted the advanced signaling technology, but they had absolutely no interest in navigating the brutal, low-margin bloodbath of the domestic British high street. Racal did not want to sell table radios designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, to suburban families. Immediately following the acquisition, Racal moved to strip the company of its consumer assets. In 1981, they sold Decca Radio and Television to Tatung, a massive, highly efficient Taiwanese manufacturing conglomerate. This 1981 sale marked the definitive end of Decca as an independent British acoustic power. Tatung did not acquire Decca because they revered the legacy of the 1946 Deccola. They did not buy it to preserve the heavy wooden cabinetry or the meticulous radar-inspired circuitry. Tatung bought Decca to secure a trusted, established British brand name and a ready-made distribution network across the United Kingdom, which would serve as a vital foothold for selling their own Asian-manufactured electronics into the lucrative European market. The immediate consequence for the British workforce was devastating. The historic Bridgnorth factory, the beating industrial heart of Decca's domestic hardware production, was slated for closure. The facility was entirely incompatible with Tatung's requirement for high-volume, lightweight, automated assembly. Operations were relocated to a different site in Telford, but the fundamental nature of the work had been irreversibly altered. Telford was not building 200-pound acoustic vaults. It was primarily assembling, packaging, and distributing imported television sets and audio hardware. The proud, heavy woodwork ceased. The complex, hand-wired power supplies were discontinued. The British cabinet makers, the circuit designers, and the veteran assembly line workers who had once built the definitive sound of the BBC Light program were made redundant. The physical infrastructure of a deeply British radio empire was systematically dismantled and replaced by the cold, highly efficient logic of the global supply chain. What followed was the tragic, accelerated dilution of the Decca badge. Throughout the 1980s, British consumers walking into high-street electrical retailers still saw the Decca name on the shelves. But the objects bearing that name bore absolutely no relation to the company's engineering heritage. The badge was slapped onto generic, low-cost portable cassette players. It was printed onto the plastic fascias of cheap clock radios, small radios combined with alarm clocks, often used beside a bed. The tuning dials, the scales showing which station the radio is tuned to, no longer moved with heavy, fluid mechanical resistance. They felt stiff, hollow, and imprecise. The loud speakers, the parts of a radio that turn the electrical signal into sound moving through air, were no longer matched carefully to deadened wooden cabinets. They were tiny, tinny, paper cones rattling inside thin plastic shells. Decca had become a ghost brand. The name remained, but the promise of reception was entirely gone. A logo that had once signified the absolute peak of British acoustic science, born from wartime submarine detection and elite stereophonic reproduction, was now being used to sell disposable bedroom electronics in discount catalogs. The British listener had traded the permanence of a heavy wooden cabinet for the convenience of an imported plastic box. The Bridgnorth lines stopped. The cabinet makers left. The service networks dissolved. The Taiwanese firm took control. The radar engineers moved on. The radiograms vanished. The heavy chassis was abandoned. The famous badge became a sticker. The plastic receivers felt hollow. The repair manuals were discarded. The British high street changed. The acoustic vault cracked. The market moved away. The sitting room grew quiet. The Decca badge did not experience a miraculous premium resurrection. Under the ownership of Tatung, the name lingered on the British high street throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, slowly bleeding its remaining cultural capital. It appeared on increasingly generic, mass-produced television sets and budget audio equipment, entirely divorced from the acoustic philosophy that had birthed it. Eventually, as the consumer electronics market transitioned fully into the digital age of flat-screen displays and integrated home theater systems, the Taiwanese parent company quietly retired the brand. Today, in the realm of domestic hardware, the Decca name is completely dead. The famous record label survives under a global conglomerate. The marine and radar technologies were absorbed by massive defense contractors, but the consumer radio and television division, the entity that once built the heaviest, most precise acoustic furniture in Britain, simply ceased to exist. However, the physical machines built during the golden age of the Bridgenorth factory have fiercely refused to disappear. The preservation of the Decca radio legacy is now entirely in the hands of the British vintage radio enthusiast community. Across the United Kingdom, on platforms like eBay and Facebook Marketplace, and deep within the technical threads of the UK Vintage Radio Repair and Restoration Forum, the true Decca receivers are still hunted, traded, and meticulously rebuilt. To restore a 1940s Decca Decola or a 1950s Decalion radiogram, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, is not a casual hobbyist endeavor. It requires a profound understanding of high-voltage electronics. Dedicated service engineers and passionate amateurs spend hundreds of hours at their repair benches, carefully replacing dried-out tuning capacitors, components that change the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, and rewiring the massive, heavy mains transformers. They source period-correct glass valves, electronic devices used to control and amplify signals, to ensure the audio circuit remains true to its original radar-grade design. These collectors perform this arduous, expensive labor because a restored Decca possesses an authority that modern digital audio fundamentally lacks. Today, an internet radio received through an internet connection rather than through broadcast signals in the air, or a smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands and online services, offers infinite convenience, but it has no physical presence. A smart speaker is a disposable plastic cylinder that hides from the room. A valve-era Decca table radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, demands to be looked at. Its heavily veneered cabinet, its warm, glowing tuning dial, and its thick, woven speaker grille, the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet, turn the act of listening into a deliberate physical ritual. Turning the heavy tuning knob to find a signal on the medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, is a tactile negotiation with the airwaves. The physical landscape that produced these machines has been completely erased. The sprawling 10-acre Bridgenorth factory complex in Shropshire, which once employed thousands of local workers and hummed with the sound of woodworking machinery and soldering stations, is gone. Available records indicate the old manufacturing footprint was eventually swept away, absorbed into the landscape of modern retail parks, light industrial units, and contemporary housing estates. There is no grand acoustic monument on the high street to mark where the Decca was built. Yet, there is a surprising footnote to the Decca hardware story. While the radio division collapsed under the weight of cheap imports, the extreme acoustic engineering they championed inadvertently fueled a global audiophile obsession that persists today. The specialized ultra-high-quality amplifier valves that Decca specified for their post-war stereograms and record reproducers, components designed to meet the ruthless standards of their military radar heritage, are now considered some of the finest audio components ever manufactured. Today, wealthy audiophiles in Tokyo, New York, and London will pay staggering sums, sometimes hundreds of pounds, for a single British glass valve, just to capture a fraction of the acoustic purity that Decca engineers achieved in a factory over 70 years ago. The radios were discarded, but the science inside them became legendary. The rise and fall of Decca radio and television is a deeply instructive British industrial tragedy. It reveals a profound contradiction in the domestic market. Britain claims to value permanence, honest engineering, heavy craftsmanship, and things built to last a lifetime. Decca provided exactly that. They built acoustic vaults designed to survive generations. But the market ultimately rewarded the exact opposite. It rewarded aggressive pricing, disposable convenience, lightweight plastics, and the relentless logic of the global supply chain. Decca did not fail because they forgot how to make a brilliant radio. They failed because the British sitting room stopped wanting to pay for one. Yet, somewhere in a quiet British front room, far away from the disposable plastic of the smart speaker generation, a heavy walnut cabinet still commands its corner, its glass dial dark, its grill dusty, waiting for a hand to turn the knob and pull one more perfect resonant voice from the air. See you in the next video.